My name is Alan Herbert. I recently completed an initial PIC type rating in the Citation Sovereign, the 680, 680A series aircraft. Thought I would tell you about it and how it was different from previous type rating experience. Previously, I've done a King Air PIC type rating. You can find that video on this channel, and in there I talk about what initial type training is like, what you focus on, what you don't, some of the challenges, some of the unique experiences, etc. You can find that here, and there you can find out more details about type training in particular. Here we'll focus more on what was unique about doing Sovereign initial training. So in general, the difference between the King Air training experience and the Sovereign training experience is that Sovereign is a two-crew aircraft. So instead of King Air being a single-person or a single-pilot airplane that is typically operated single-pilot and sometimes with an SIC, the Sovereign always has a PIC and an SIC, or a pilot not flying and a pilot not flying. So there's some new crew dynamics to integrate there, and some additional systems and complexity associated with a more complicated airplane. I did my training in the Legacy Sovereign, the straight 680 that was certified back in 2004 time period. The interesting thing about that is that training in that aircraft, that series of aircraft, is also valid for the Citation Sovereign Plus as well as the Citation Latitude. They're all one family of airplanes with common type rating. So the course lasts 16 days to get an initial type in the Citation Sovereign family of aircraft. That's spread across ground and flight simulator training. That course is largely representative of Part 25 type training for business aircraft of this type. There are longer courses, there are shorter courses. Roughly speaking, it's similar to King Air, but I believe King Air was a few days shorter time period. The other big difference was there's a little bit more focus on ground training in the Sovereign school prior to entering the sim. The actual ground school portion is the same length, but there's a few more days of, shall we call it, warm-up period with some ground-based simulator familiarization. I did the training at Flight Safety International in Wichita, Kansas. Their facility that I did the training at has a wide range of Citation products. So for ground school, just like in the King Air, you're going to look at all the aircraft systems, review all the limitations, look at procedures, etc. The challenge with the Sovereign is you add a little bit of additional complexity in that you have substantially more hydraulic systems, you have a little bit more complex propulsion system, you also have a little bit different avionics. The Sovereign, or Legacy Sovereign, has Honeywell versus the Garmin G1000 in the King Air course I took. So there's definitely some refreshing that had to go on there with regard to the avionics. Performance makes up another large component of the training process for ground school. So performance in the King Air is book-based. There's not a lot of electronic tools available for that, so it's a lot of tabbing through data and interpolating between points. The Sovereign has the same deal. They've got, a performance manual that's thick and covers operations from sea level to 47,000 feet for takeoff, climb, cruise, approach, landing, all that stuff. The difference is Textron/Cessna publishes a couple of electronic tools to help with that, which are really useful. Makes performance planning a dramatically simpler process versus the King Air. So while we did look at the books and familiarize with, okay, here's where these charts are, etc., etc., we then transitioned to using the electronic tools. And there's a desktop version as well as an iPad version. The nice thing about the electronic tools is they are much more precise. So they're running actual calculations to expand the data for performance down to the condition you specify. So rather than trying to interpolate between a takeoff field elevation of, say, 3,000 feet and 4,000 feet for an airport that's at 3,562 feet, the electronic tools can go in and actually run a calculation at that actual airport elevation. Similar with temperature, climb, cruise, altitudes, etc. So it's much more precise, and it's simpler and it's quicker. So that was a big bonus. It makes planning a mission much simpler, much quicker, easier process. They also integrate weight and balance into those tools, so it's very easy to go plug in all your passenger, all your payload weights, and get an exact fuel burn line rather than estimating as you would be doing with paper charts. The big shift in ground school was a greater emphasis on the ground-based flight simulators. These are static avionics training tools that focus on checklists and systems integration. So when you're doing training with these, it's a touchscreen computer interface, and then in the case of the FMS, there are a couple of physical controls to help manipulate things there, but it's focused on getting crews comfortable working with one another, on checklists, on procedures, knowing where switches and knobs and buttons are, getting familiar with common failure modes, getting familiar with how to do pre-flight. These complex turbine aircraft have fairly extensive pre-flight procedures, so knowing how to flow through those quickly and efficiently is part of being a professional flight crew. So you spend time learning all that in the GFS, as they call it, before you go get in the simulator. The benefit of that is saves you a fair bit of time in the simulator itself. The other benefit to the GFS is the fact that the Sovereign, being a dual crew airplane, requires you to have a crew member with you as part of your check ride and your simulator training, rather than King Air, where it was you worked in a team of two, but you're really doing things on your own. As a result, you get a couple of days to really get acclimated to your crew member and understand how to work together as a team. Obviously, there's personality differences that have to be worked through and understood. There's expectations that have to be set, etc., etc. So the GFS gives you an opportunity to set the groundwork for being an effective crew once you get to the actual simulator. So there are two kind of big things for me during type training on the Sovereign that were radically different than the King Air. One, and I would say this is the biggest thing, was the difference between single crew and dual crew operations. Now, fortunately, I have a fair bit of prior time flying as an SIC on multi-turbine aircraft. So dual crew operations are not unique in my previous experience. The difference was now you're doing PIC crew training. So you got to be in command. That's that whole pilot in command bit. We get used to being the pilot in command in our single engine pistons or our light twins or our single pilot qual turbines. But then when you have a crew, suddenly you have to make this mental switch from being the single guy in charge to being the single guy in charge who's responsible for the actions of other crew members. And that can be a bit of a challenge to make that switch. The second thing that's a little different is this is a lot more automated airplane than the King Air. As a result, some things are a lot easier. Some things are a lot harder. So you have to pay attention to what you're doing and not let previous type training experiences or other airplanes seep their way into this airplane and this training environment. You have to be focused on the airplane you're flying at the time. In King Air training, because you're the only pilot flying, by the time you get to your check ride, the expectation is that your sim partner over there in the right seat is just going to sit there and watch. They're not going to help you. They're not going to remind you on things. You got to do it yourself. Multi-crew airplanes, you suddenly have two sets of hands, two brains, two sets of eyes, all that good stuff, right? So now you've got this helper over here who can do a lot of things for you as the pilot flying. So once you are the pilot flying, the emphasis becomes on keeping the air pointed in the right direction, doing the right thing, calling for configuration changes, paying attention to and adhering to ATC commands, and then calling for the appropriate checklists, etc. from the pilot not flying. So it's that transition from being the guy who has to do everything to the guy who has to do some flying and command other stuff to get done. So making that transition is kind of the trick. So the pilot and pilot not flying roles are clearly delineated. For the guy not flying, the PNF, pilot not flying, SIC, right seat, is that you are now systems operator, radio operator, checklist operator, FMS operator. You've got a lot more to do in the right seat. So all those tasks that you were doing as a single pilot now get even larger on top of the flying, because there's just more complexity to it. There's more checklists to go through. There's more. There's just more of everything. So you end up being fairly busy as the right seat guy. So you end up in this dynamic where the pilot flying has to kind of moderate task saturation for the guy who's not flying, because it's easy to get behind the captain as the co-pilot. It also means as the co-pilot, if you need a minute to get something set up that you've been asked to do, you got to speak up. That's that team dynamic that you have to work on. So as a pilot not flying, my biggest recommendation would be stay ahead of the PIC. Anticipate what the PIC is going to need. So if you're flying a single engine approach, have that checklist up well before he calls for it. That way you're not behind the ball. It's all about staying ahead of the airplane, just like we would in anything else that we're flying. So the challenge is everything happens faster. The Sovereign will run around at 250 knots all day very easily without, any stress. You're not really producing a lot of thrust to get there, right? So it becomes very easy to get places very quickly and get behind the airplane. So customizing yourself to managing that speed of workflow is really important. And then that just goes doubly so once you start getting into emergencies. Now, like I said, the Sovereign is a much more automated aircraft than the King Air. You still have all that checklist stuff to run though. So, and it's happening faster. So instead of your King Air failure happening at 130, 140 knots, now your Sovereign failure is happening at 200 knots. So you're going to suddenly be from your point of failure to final approach fix much, much faster. Staying ahead of that checklist becomes critical. So memory items are still present, but it's also more than just memory items. You can do that, and that meets the bare FAA minimums, but you also need to be familiar with what to do next. And that's not different than the King Air per se, it's just you need to be able to do it quicker. And that's where working as a team, dividing your labor appropriately, becomes a really important thing to do. So the check ride. You're still going to take a check ride, and in fact you get to take the check ride twice. You're going to take it once in the right seat, once in the left seat. And you're going to be evaluated in both seats. So you can fail your check ride from the right seat, and you can fail your check ride just as easily from the left seat. So working through the general structure of that day, you're still going to do a briefing, you're still going to do a oral portion of the exam. That again will be a team effort where both crew members are in the room and the examiners just kind of bounce questions back and forth. You're going to do a graphical pre-flight walk-around thing. That's all pretty well the same. It's all limitations and memory items, etc., which is in line with King Air. There wasn't really any notable differences there. There's a little bit more to cover just because you're talking about doing that with a more complicated airplane, but again, not a big deal. The real difference then is the check ride. So I personally elected to go right seat first because I wanted to do the hard part first. Frankly, the right seat half of the check ride is harder because the examiner is going to throw stuff at the PIC very, very quickly. You've got a 2-hour block and a lot of stuff to get through, so you're going to kind of move from thing to thing to thing without a lot of pause in between them. So the trick is to run things efficiently. So that right seater is going to have his work cut out for him initially. For the check ride itself, though, as pilot not flying, you've seen it all before. So you're going to flow through the same basic stuff. Having worked with your sim partner for several days now, a week plus, there shouldn't be any surprises. Everybody should kind of know what to expect and how to proceed. So that you get done with that half of the check ride, you go take a break, and you swap seats, get back in the sim, and do it again. Now, there tends to be a little bit of subtle differences between the two, because obviously flight safety doesn't want you to memorize it and then just lather, rinse, repeat. So there'll be a little bit different sequence of events, but you're going to still have to cover the same stuff. You're going to be looking at normal takeoffs, steep turns, stalls, normal approach, go around, single engine approach, single engine go around, all that stuff. You'll look at systems failures, right? The airplane will only really work for about the first 20 minutes of the check ride. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with failures and checklist usage, which is the point. It's also important once you are the guy flying, after you've done that swap and now you're in the left seat, remember, the guy over there is also getting evaluated, so give him the time and space he needs to accomplish his task. So don't go blasting into the final approach fix at 250 knots with a dead engine while he's furiously trying to play catch up. That's not good crew coordination. You can fail the check ride for that. Pay attention to that stuff. Take the time you need. There's no bonus points for going fast. The nice thing is, if you go first in the left seat, you do the easy part first, you kind of know what's coming for doing the right seat stuff, and vice versa. If you do the right seat stuff first, then you kind of know what's coming on the left seat side of things. So it works. It's an effective system. It's not too big a deal. By the time you're done, you're ready to be done. The nice thing is flight safety is not trying to back you up into some corner and cause problems for you. They're trying to help you get through the finish line. So in conclusion, if you're going into an initial PIC type and a Sovereign or any other multi-crew airplane, be prepared to make that transition from only guy in the cockpit to that command authority thing. It's not about being domineering, it's not about being in charge, so to speak. It's just about being in command of the aircraft, and that means being in command of not just the physical flight controls and avionics, but also the crew members. Again, not a big deal, just something to be aware of. And flight safety does a good job with their instructors of helping folks work through that. If they find a deficiency there, they're going to work with you on it. It's not a catastrophe if you don't have that previously. The 680 initial PIC training is a lot of fun. It comes with a lot of work. It's definitely a lot of studying. It's a lot of prep work. It's a lot of homework to do well. But if you put that time and effort in, and it's an enjoyable experience, and it's worth doing. It's not something that should be intimidating. It should just be something that's taken with some seriousness and some gravitas, if you will. But otherwise, go and enjoy it. Have fun. Enjoy the people you get to work with while you're there. Network with them. Get to know them. You're probably going to see them again in a year when you're there for recurrent training. So know that everybody's there to succeed together and work as a team to get through it. So like, subscribe, share, all those good things. Hopefully this was informative and helpful for anybody going to get Citation or Sovereign training. Thank you.